Good evening, everybody, and welcome. We are so excited that so many of you could join us today for On the Future of Disability Lineage. My name is Alex Elliott, and I am the Senior Manager of Events and Engagement for the Public Programs Department of California Institute of Integral Studies, a nonprofit university in San Francisco. As many of us are descendants of settlers, immigrants, or descendants of those forcefully brought to this continent, we, CIIS public programs, must recognize and never forget that our university's building in San Francisco occupies traditional, unceded Ramaytush Ohlone lands. If you're interested in learning more about Native lands, languages, and territories, we encourage you to visit native-land.ca. Now, let me first introduce our presenters, Jennifer Natalya Fink and Sara Acevedo, and then we will get right to their conversation. Dr. Sara Acevedo is an autistic, mestiza, critical educator, and disability studies scholar activist, born and raised in Colombia. She is an assistant professor of disability studies at Miami University in Ohio. Her formal training is in historical linguistics, action anthropology, and disability studies, and she's an alumna of the Anthropology and Social Change PhD program here at CIIS. Dr. Acevedo recently finished a 3-year term with the board of directors of the Society for Disability Studies and currently serves on the editorial boards of Disability in the Global South, the International Journal, and AUT, the Journal of Autistic Culture. Her activist research agenda focuses on grassroots disabled leadership, horizontal organizing, the politics of self-direction and self-governance, and the creation of liberated communities and autonomous spaces by and for neurodivergent people living at the intersection of other minoritized identities. Jennifer Natalya Fink is director of the program in disability studies and a professor of English at Georgetown University. She's the author of 6 books and founder of the Guerrilla Press, a nonprofit promoting youth literacy through bookmaking. Fink is the winner of the Dana Award for the novel and the Catherine Doctorow Prize for Innovative Fiction, as well as a finalist for the Lambda Literary Award. First and foremost, she is a mother. The transformative experience of parenting her autistic daughter is the center of her work. And now it is my absolute pleasure to turn it over to Sara and Jennifer.
Thank you so much, Alex. Oh, sorry. Sorry, Jennifer. Thank you so much, Alex, and everybody at Public Programs at CIIS. It's such a pleasure to be back in the space, although remotely. I do miss CIIS. I do miss San Francisco. I do miss the Bay Area and its vibrant activist culture, especially around disability justice. So thank you so much for inviting me back. I'm so delighted to be in conversation with Jennifer today. Her book is fantastic, totally transformational. It especially spoke to me because I am an autistic person. But we will get more into that after some introductions and descriptions, personal descriptions, and some land acknowledgements. I'll start by describing myself. I am a woman of a very pale skin, mestiza heritage. I have curly hair, short to the chin. I'm wearing blue. Well, I don't know if you can appreciate it, but it's blue, and it's buttoned down, and I'm wearing a gold necklace. And I have big brown eyes, and I have a little bit of a purple lipstick. And okay, so with that, I'm going to read the land acknowledgement for Miami University, which is where I teach. It's located in Oxford, Ohio. Miami University is located within the traditional homelands of the Miami and Shawnee people, who along with other indigenous groups ceded these lands to the United States in the first Treaty of Greenville in 1795. The Miami people, whose name our university carries were forcibly removed from these homelands in 1846. Despite centuries of colonization, the Miami people preserve a deep connection to this land and are engaged in a vibrant resurgence of their heritage, language, and culture. Thank you. Jennifer, please, it's our pleasure to welcome you today.
Oh, thank you so much for that introduction. And thank all of you for coming tonight amidst war, COVID, and all the rest. Happy Thursday. We're slouching towards Friday. We're almost there on the East Coast. You've got a little more time. I'm Jennifer Natalya Fink, she, her, hers pronouns. I'm a white middle-aged woman in a red shirt with black curly hair, shoulder length, and a gray background of a lake behind me. Welcome everybody. I'm so delighted to be here this evening to share all our families' disability lineage and the future of kinship with you, and to be in conversation with a truly brilliant thinker and writer, Sara M. Acevedo. I am coming to you live from unceded Piscataway Nacotchunk territory in glamorous Gaithersburg, Maryland. And I encourage you, if you're on this call, to take just a second. It takes 30 seconds or less to Google whose territory you are on. You put in the Google box, whose territory am I on? 5 seconds and you know. And now you can't unknow that, right? Now, I have to say, I kind of hate it personally when some white lady in, let's just say, like a bright red shirt gets up and makes this kind of virtue signaling proclamation without action. So let's turn this statement of fact into a call to action, a call to restorative justice for Nacotchunk, Piscataway, and all BIPOC people. And you to join me, lead me, meet me in that work. One first step that was mentioned was nativegov.org. If you're on Piscataway, you can learn more about the Piscataway people in the present, piscatawaytribe.org. And a really good resource for action items is narf.org. And I'd love to hear if people have other ideas about this, including Sara. I do have some thank yous. Thanks to Joanna Green, my editor at Beacon, as well as Priyanka Ray, Christian Coleman, Allison Rodriguez, and the whole Beacon team. Thanks to Amanda Ennis, my agent at Trident Media, who helped me turn what was a glimmer of an idea into a book. And thank you to the CIIS team, especially Emlyn and Alex, for their hard work making this event happen. And thanks to Sara M. Acevedo, again, for her brilliant interlocution tonight. Thank you, Sara.
Thank you, Jennifer.
And then I just want to thank all my families, just like the title says, especially my daughter, Nadia, who is the joy and center of my life and who might bust in here any minute. Ooh, there's the book, yay. And Sarah Sohn, my partner in parenting and more. And then I'm going to thank my ancestors. Thanks to Rona and cousin XY, Grandma Adina, Shalif Lewis, and all our disabled kin. Zikrona Livroka, let their memory be a blessing, let their memory be a revolution. I'm going to read, if it's okay, Sara, just the first, because Sara's read the book, I wrote the book, but you guys probably haven't read the book because it came out like 3 seconds ago. So I'm just going to read a teeny bit just so you get what the setup is, and there's a story. So I'm going to tell you a story, okay? It's quick. I'm walking through room after room in my grandparents' cavernous Long Island house, looking for my cousin. Cousin, cousin, I call, wishing I knew his name. Cousin XY, I call. I know he's a boy, and I'm a geneticist's daughter. Chromosomes count. Cousin XY visits me in my dreams. He has his father's eyes. My cousin XY, as I called him, was born in 1972 with Down syndrome and immediately abandoned. He was listed only as baby XY. I always knew my aunt and uncle had, quote, given away their son at birth. His very existence was explained to me as a tragedy, a crisis, an aberration that perhaps science could one day prevent. In the hospital on the day he was born, his mother refused to look at his face, take him away. So goes the family story. My grandfather, a family doctor, the family medical expert, was firm. Give him up. You can start over. You have a right to real children. He'll be happier there. Where was there? I often wondered where my cousin was, who he was. Silence in neurotypical children quickly replaced him in the family narrative. On the rare occasions when his existence came up, everyone gave them away was repeated as gospel truth. And indeed, in the 1970s, institutionalization, abandonment, and excision from the family narrative was still too often the fate of those labeled incurable at birth. But I discovered that was not the whole truth. As with most families, probably yours, the story of my family's disability lineage had far more strands than I realized. In 2017, when I was visiting a far-flung branch of my family in Manchester, UK, I discovered that there was another cousin in my family with Down syndrome, also on my father's side, buried in plain sight, Rona. Born in Scotland in 1946, 2 decades before cousin XY, Rona lived in apparent happiness, first with her nuclear family in Glasgow, and then in a group home called Cosgrove, which her mother helped found for disabled Jewish people. True to her name, Rona means joy in Hebrew. She lived a joyous Jewish life. So 2 of my family members have been written out of the family story, delineated from our lineage. I mourned what I had never had, both a lived relationship with my cousins and a family myth that could include them. I wondered how the knowledge of a rich, deep history of disability in my family would have changed my experience of my own daughter's diagnosis at age 2 as a disabled, non-speaking autistic person. If I had grown up playing with cousin XY, would we have experienced her disability as part of the warp and woof of our lineage instead of as a personal disaster, rending us from the fabric of the family? And in the book, I talk about, that trauma and where I think it came from. Those were the questions that led me to think about disability lineage and what the implications of repressing, hiding, finding, and celebrating it might be for disabled people and their families everywhere. By cutting me off from knowledge of my disabled cousins, I had no source of disability knowledge and history and wisdom in my family. Their lives were treated as extraordinary, disposable, and traumatic, so traumatic that the very fact of them was hidden, erased from the story our family told about itself. Now, this is typical of how disability is narrated in the family myths passed down from one generation to another. Disability is erased, repressed, covered over. Families delineate, destroy the connection between generations of disabled people, their families, and their caretakers. Our disabled kin are not merely misrepresented, they are written out of the story. By examining the ways families excise disability from their stories, I began to see how disability is fundamentally shaped by this omission. The way we assign meanings to bodies and minds, establish norms, otherize and stigmatize according to perceptions of ability, is inseparable from how we name and claim our kin. Family is defined and produced by eradicating disability lineage, often making the inevitable appearance of disability within a given family a crisis, a trauma to be erased, effaced, unwritten. I refer to this process as delineation, the separation of disabled people from their lineage. Now, this is what's interesting. The word delineate literally means to mark off with lines and thus separate, right? But it includes the word lineate, derived from lineage, family ancestry. So the delineation I'm examining here is sometimes literal, with the institutionalization of my cousin. It is sometimes rhetorical, as with the suppression of cousin Rona and her disability from the family narrative. But here's the really interesting thing. Delineate also means to describe, right, or portray, a form of inclusion. So within the word itself lies the potential to relineate, to sew a family member back into the fold, to describe, portray, and thus connect. And that's what I explore in this book. I'll stop there for now.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. My service dog Coco has decided to join us, and it's really, really heavy. He's so heavy, and he really wants off. Anyways, it's really, really emotional to just hear you read it, because I've spent so much time with this book in the past few weeks. But it just acquires a different quality, different affect when I hear you read it, and it's so emotional just because I feel it so deeply as a disabled person. So I often, while reading it, I often wondered, I just wonder the differences, in readership. What did non-disabled people would feel when they read it? And how different an affect it is for a disabled person, not to separate us, but just simply to expand upon how deeply rooted these histories are within our kin, our disabled kin, as Shada Cafe names it, our crib kin. So thank you. It's really, really touched me very deeply. and with that, I would like to ask you some questions and get more deeply into this conversation with you. So the first question I have, and I have context for all the questions. I've always been fascinated by words. I am a trained linguist, so it comes as no surprise that this aspect of the book immediately caught my attention. Delineation, lineation, lineage, relineate. So one of the most remarkable ideas you explore concerns the term delineation, which, as you explain, carries within itself a history of oppression and a potential for liberation in what concerns disability, lineage, and family narrative. Could you please expand upon this?
Yeah, definitely. And thank you for sharing with me that this, touched you. That's my greatest wish. It really is for people to feel seen, especially disabled people who, experience this in their families. So, as I said in the introduction, delineate has this doubleness, this tension in the word itself, which is sort of why I focalize a lot with it, because it's to cut out, mark, separate, but it's also to call in, right? And even that demarcation, separation has two aspects of it. The first thing I'm really calling on all of us to do is to assume we always were there. There always were disabled people in all of our lineages. And I was really struck by Stacy Milburn and others who talk about sort of calling out to like a mythic ancestral plane, but they always start by saying there were no disabled people ever in my family. I thought that's not true. You've been denied that knowledge, which doesn't mean we don't need like a more spiritual calling out, but we also need to know. And even if it's a little unknowable, say I'm adopted, or there was so much silence and now everybody's dead, or whatever, just the act of performatively saying, I believe there were disabled people in my family before me. I know that to be true. Even if I can't, trace all of them. I think that changes something. So that's one piece of it. It's just assuming people existed before us, right? We were here before. So that's one piece of it. And actually finding them is sometimes easier than you'd imagine. And by finding cousin XY, I found this other cousin. One thing leads to another. Once you're out about something, once you're talking about it, it's amazing how that works. And I even have tips in the appendix about like, how do you do that? So there's that. There's the practical piece, but there's also sort of the deeper piece of just what would it mean if we didn't say there were no disabled people in my family? What if we said there were? Right? So that's one piece of it, that reimagining, that relineating with my cousin's story, right? Then the other piece that I talk about my mom and my grandmother, which is there are people in our family who aren't cut out, who do have disabilities, that there's a lot of toxic shame and stigma about talking about it explicitly. This is especially true with mental disabilities. This is sometimes true with autism. This is sometimes, and they're not even necessarily invisible disabilities. My grandmother, her life was profoundly shaped by her deafness, and it was unspeakable in my family. So when we reimagine our disability lineage, we also revalue and rethink the people in our family who were disabled but didn't claim that as an identity. I say my grandmother, I can still see the look on her face. She was very phobic about disability, and especially about disabled children. She got this look of disgust, right? Which she maybe felt about herself. I don't know. So, but I can claim her as an ancestor. She's passed. And I talk about my ring that I'm not giving you the finger that I wear on my ring finger. That's hers. So I think it's not all cuddly and warm reclaiming. Like I'm also, coming to terms with that ableism of my grandmother and my mother to some degree, right? But we can revalue it, we can resignify it, we can change what it means. So the stigma and shame are so great that we never acknowledge the disability in some cases. I'm obsessed with cloth and fabric and sewing, and sort of thinking of this as like we're sewing this ancestral cloth that we can wrap ourselves around and hand down to the next generation. So I think that's sort of how I'm thinking about the complexity of this, reaching back into an unknown past, resignifying, making a new meaning out of what we do know, right? Valuing it, to sew it into a cloth that, in my case, I have a daughter with a disability, that I can make it usable for her. And see her as part of something rather than this, trauma cut out of the family cloth. To see her in that lineage is super important to me. And I use Jewish ritual. It was funny. I wrote this thing for the New York Times, and I said, I prayed to my deaf grandmother, and they were like, don't you pray to God? I said, no, I don't. I do pray, and they're like, what? But so for me, the spirituality is in that connection and making that usable for my daughter and for my family. That makes sense.
Yeah, it's fascinating because of all the things you said just now, I was making myself so many connections to other things, of course, in your book, but of course through my own reading and my own interpretations, and the things that of course resonated for me in my own family lineages. When you're talking about it's not that you didn't have disabled ancestors, it's that you were denied that history, that part of your history. I immediately connected it with the part where you're talking about genes. And when you're talking about Steve Silverin and neurotribes and discussing, neurodivergence and genes and how old these genes are, and just thinking about how I was denied of that history, not by my family, because my family didn't even know, but by the systems, the racialized, gendered class systems, that fascist systems that deny people like me an autism diagnosis, because we do not conform to a textbook delineation, demarcation of what autism is supposed to be, according to those histories of fascism coming from Asperger's to others who have, of course, before him, and after. And so that just really made me think about how it's within our families, but it expands into our cultural families, our cultural kin. So that was something that was just thinking about the fact that these genes are old, just kind of made me feel like part of that old gene family of my autistic kin through genes. And it just felt good.
Because so often that all that genetic discourse is used to do is genocidal, right?
Exactly.
Abort, institutionalize,
yes.
keep these people from having children. Let's
yes.
do genetic testing, but it doesn't have to be. It can be part. I don't see science as the enemy. These are tools. We can use them any way we want. So that could be, finding your heritage as an autistic person, right, and valuing it. And
exactly.
Diagnosis doesn't have to be delineating. It could be finding your people in tribe. And that's something I talk about in the book. My daughter, I was like, I think she's autistic. And the doctor said to me, I see a perfectly normal child and a very neurotic mother. Of course, 6 months later, she had the diagnosis, because she made good eye contact and fit the male defined idea of what an autistic kid looks like, right? So I think the cultural piece is huge, and part of what a couple things. First, my greatest hope for this book is not that my family, it's not because we're so screwed up that I want to tell the story, we're just one family, right? But what I hope is really everybody, whether they identify as disabled or not, when they read the book, say, I wonder what my disability lineage was. How could that help me? How could that help my family, right? How could that empower us? And the other piece of it is the thing that nobody did when my kid was diagnosed was say, you're now part of a community.
Yes.
Find your people for your daughter. She needs to find her people. And you as a family need to find a larger family. It was all, this is an individual problem to be solved. One doctor said, I'm sure you're upset and, get over it because now you have to fight for your kid, fight for what? What was I fighting? What was this war I was supposed to be in? And nobody says, find your people. This is an identity. This is a community, right? It's just this medicalized individual problem to isolate you. And I think that's such a travesty.
It really is. Yeah, it really is. I myself writing. I'm writing right now about autistic activism through the analytic of contagion.
Oh, wow.
Precisely because of this whole, power reversal, like utilizing this idea of contagion as a biological, viral, medical unit to then transfer that into cultural contagion and how we are pushed into those fringes because we fight medicalization. And so my approach to your analysis of genes is for the first time, I think positive, because I'm so used to encountering people who are so happily telling me that they're still, this is obviously dated, but people talking about the autism gene and finding the autism gene amongst my colleagues, not my direct colleagues, but people that I encounter in academia wanting to discover the autism gene to eradicate it before they don't even know I'm autistic. So I always have this really gut reaction to the whole idea of gene. So this time it was a different refiguration, a different idea of it, like what you speak of with the osmotanchis, that just regain a different form and thus affect for me. So it's not, I don't have as much aversion to it because I know it can be reimagined.
Oh, that's wonderful. And I think, too often there's this false binary, like you're anti-science if you won't accede to this sort of genocidal narrative, but there's nothing to, and the problem is, and Rosemary Garland Thompson has been very good about this, like who's doing this research and with what agenda, if disabled people aren't included in that conversation, right? Then the research aims to eradicate, delineate, destroy, murder, and I think it's so important that we're inside that conversation and not just subjected to these tools and see them as community building potentially in some way.
Absolutely. Yeah.
People use ancestry.com to find their lost kin and their lost heritage and their ethnicity and like, oh, I'm part Black or I'm part this and I'm part that. I think the same thing, like this could be used productively for disabled people, not to pathologize or delineate, but to call in to find the cousin or the heritage potentially. So I think that's a piece of it that I really, because my dad's a geneticist and was born into this science discourse that was so toxic and phobic in so many ways. And also as a queer person, I saw much of the same discourse around queerness, especially in the 90s. Let's find the gay gene so we can get rid of right? As opposed to so that we understand ourselves better and connect more deeply, right? So I think that is really important to me, to not to kind of not leave science to a genocidal ableist
of course
project,
of course, a reclamation of it. Well, it's clear that you and I could spend hours and hours talking about this, but we're getting time checks, so I think we have to move on.
Sure.
Okay, so moving on to my next question. Okay, so here's my context. You touch on the inextricable link between the social relations that construct care as a burden and the physical, both the physical and rhetorical delineation of disability from the normative family narrative, which is just mentioned in the introduction, speaking of both institutionalization and rhetorical delineation. So my question is, could you please discuss the implications of race, class, disability, of course, and gender in the construction of care as a burden? And I'm referring to care labor here.
Yeah, thank you for that. I'm going to start with a personal admission that's a little like embarrassing to me. So when I was pregnant, it was very hard for me to get pregnant. It took me years, and there was still in 2007 the do you want a boy or a girl, right? And I actually wanted a girl, but you weren't allowed to say that, right? What you were supposed to say, that's the question. What is the answer? Everyone knows it. As long as it's healthy.
Oh yeah.
Right? That's the correct response. So when I was thinking about all of this, I start there in unpacking race, gender, colonialism, all of it, because what's happened is we're really dishonest about care labor in this country. When my mother had me, she wanted a boy and had no shame in saying it or telling me. She's apologized since, right? That was the norm. Of course you wanted a boy. Why would you want a girl when all girls do is care for other people? All they do is care labor, right? The truth is girls do other things now and women do other things, but women do like almost 100%.
Yes.
Right? To be a woman is to care is to be a woman in uncompensated, unvalued ways. So I was very scared of having a child with a disability. I wouldn't have said it that way, like I had all these layers of denial, but I bargained with the universe and said, it's fine if I have a boy, even though I really want a girl, as long as it's healthy, And by healthy, I meant what is healthy? If the baby all babies are sick, like anyone who has a child out there knows, they're just like sick all the time. 0.5% of disabilities are diagnosed at birth. By age 60, 40% of all people have disabilities. Okay. So this is a fantasy with many layers, right? It's a displacement because we're not honest about gender and care labor. It's a displacement. It's on the backs of disabled people. We say we're going to pretend that we don't care about gender. We care a lot about gender because gender organizes everything in the society, right? But say as long as it's healthy, right? Well, there are no it's, first of all. Non-binary people are not it's. Nobody's an it. Right. And what are we saying there? We're saying we don't accept a disabled person. That's totally socially acceptable to say.
Yeah.
In a way, saying I want a girl was not. So I went back and unpacked that and then went into, there's tons, people far smarter than me, Asian food, like lots of people have done a lot of work on sort of the global economy of care work that really started in carceral slavery, where Black women did the care labor, were the wet nurses, and it was not even from Reconstruction on, it is not viewed as work. It is part of the condition of being a Black woman.
Absolutely.
That's where we begin in this country with our notions of care. Now it moves to a global economy of underpaid women of color from the global South, from South Asia, who this is the only way for them to get access to citizenship, to all kinds of things, right? So it's compelled, essentially.
Yes.
Compelled, underpaid, still not viewed as work, right? So there's lots of work on this, but I really wanted to connect that to sort of, I'm a white, Jewish, upper middle class woman, that there are a bunch of fears here for white women about being deprofessionalized by a disabled child, that you'll be thrown back into this role. Right. And then for women of color, even some white working class women, what happens is you don't not get deprofessionalized, you end up in poverty, right? Because of the lack of a care system. Yes. So so I was sort of trying to connect this whole system. In all cases, the care is a problem to be solved by an individual in our culture. And the disabled person is essentially blamed for it. Exactly. So I think that, and I saw that when I looked at the research in across the board. And then I came back to my own experience of going to these support groups for parents of kids with disabilities that were for parents. But again, the insane dishonesty, it drives me nuts. Parent groups with not a single male person, with not a single father, and we'd be like the only couple, So I think
that's normalized too.
Totally normalized, right? So these are, educated, affluent, liberal people, right? So I think there's just incredible dishonesty around this. about the gendering of care, the devaluing of care, the lack of any recognition that there could be pleasure in care, right? Or the sharing of it, and its inevitability again, right? We're all going to need care at some point in the life cycle. And then I also saw this honestly in disability justice communities, in mutual aid, that, you know, I felt very scared to say it aloud. I felt like I'm saying, you know, you're not supposed to say, but what I saw was these are young people who are not doing elder care, do not have children. There's no space for that in this conversation. So I think we need to connect some of these discourses so that we can sort of begin to think beyond the fantasies of even mutuality is not always possible, right? Everybody will have high care needs at some point in their life if they should live so long. And that this cannot be this silent feminization, you know, that then leads to a kind of fear and pathologizing and delineation of disabled people. Until we get honest about that. And I don't have all the answers, you know, some people are like, well, so fix it. You know, there's smarter people than I who do have good ideas about that. But the piece, this delineation is connected to these fears of women being thrown back into this role without social supports. And some of the mutual aid stuff is really operating on a phantasmatic level, really about what real care work would
absolutely
mean. Transformation in a sustainable way, accessible for everybody.
And what you mentioned about this idea of deprofessionalization, which is it's a real fear. It's also reinvented within the profession because we are performing care and emotional labor within our professions. Like I have to speak as a disabled mestiza immigrant person, how much care and emotional labor I have to perform in the academy. How much is left to me to lead DEI initiatives, DEI initiatives, sorry, to not expected, but to how can I not support a student who is minoritized and is struggling? How can I not resonate with another colleague who is going through the same? How can I not be a part of that lineage? And so it is reproduced within the family, and then out we are doing the same thing in our profession.
Absolutely.
So it's a matrix that is just, and you said it very well, yes, gender is actually a structuring element in our society, in our very patriarchal, cis-heteropatriarchal society. So that's why, and as Silvia Federici and other neo-Marxist feminists, autonomous feminists have discussed it so well, this is why the persecution started so early.
Yes, before child was even born, we're saying, don't be disabled, don't you dare be disabled, you know.
Exactly.
And you know, it's understandable in one way because of not understood like okay, but the fear of being deprofessionalized, of, you know, for Black women who have sons who are autistic, it's like
yes.
8 times more likely to be targets of police violence, you know, like that's real, man, you know. So I think, but the dishonesty is what drives me crazy, because we can't really approach this. And there is something in academia of sort of, I've heard this discourse of that's sort of like women and femmes do all this labor, and it's sort of eternalized in some way. And it's something that
Yeah.
as a queer person, you know, and then I see like queer people like disidentify with that role, but it's not really about identifying with or against it. It's about changing the structure. And
Yeah.
that's why, you know, I want to get beyond kind of the identitarian way of talking about this that I was in some way. I was like, well, I have an egalitarian partnership with a woman.
Yeah.
Like, I'm not going to be stuck in this
Yes.
horrible role, you know. But it's not really about individual, you know.
Exactly.
It really has
It's
to have
systemic.
a way, and it's not about disidentifying with being like this, you know, dish rag woman who cares for everybody, you know, or embracing that. You know, I see that in academia as well. Like there's sort of these two moves, like, well, you know, I don't identify with being female or femininity, so I'm not going to be in that role, or I over-identify, I'm going to embrace
Yes.
that and be like
Yes.
that professor who you know, and never do my research, or, you know, there's that binary, you're screwed either way if you're
screwed either. That's exactly what I was getting at before. You're screwed either way.
Yeah, so we have to really be honest about that and look at who's not doing care work, which, and I you know, it's not like I hate men, I hate inequality.
No. Yes,
And
same.
men do not do care work, full stop.
No, they do not.
Rarely do. They are treated like heroes, and, you know, so that just has to be exposed and remediated, essentially.
Absolutely. Yes. Oh, okay. So much to think about. Okay. Where is this other question that I really wanted to discuss with you? Yes. All our families envisioned heavily policed public spaces as sites ripe or prime for divergent expression and cultural reclamation, particularly for raised and gendered body minds. As you trace your own family lineage, you imagine a relineation of disability experiences dislocated from their family narratives into collective kinship systems wherein disability becomes radically visible. Finally, you position disability justice activism as the basis of this reparative relineation. Could you please unpack the intricacies of this process?
Yeah, I mean, that's a lot. And that's
a lot.
Thank you for so clearly articulating sort of, you know, the heart of the book in a lot of ways. So I think the core thing that's sort of the starting place for that is really teasing out this binary between the public and the private. This view of like the family is this private space, right? And then there's the public space. And I get into this around Melissa Blake and the Meet Your New Teacher TikTok challenge, which is this horrific ableist disaster using a visibly disabled woman's appearance and saying, haha, kids, this is your new teacher.
I don't know that.
Yeah, so, you know, like, there isn't a separation really. The family operates in public, right? And the public is imagined in the family, right? What are people going to think about my kid? When people talk about, you know, their fears, it's a lot about the gaze of society, right? That then regulates how the family deals with disability internally, right? So part of why families delineate is because of the imagined public inside the family, and all families exist in public to some degree, right? It's not you go out in the world. So I first kind of take apart that binary and that delineation as a regulatory mechanism, building a little on Susan Schweik's work on the ugly laws, which disabled people being in public, which still kind of shape all of this, and then look at my own way, the way that operate in my own imaginary, both in my extended family and in the family I've created. And staring is like one symptom of that.
And you describe that so well, how you reverse that and how you use it. Yes.
So I think in relineating the supposedly private narrative of the family space, we could change and challenge the public one, and vice versa. So I think for me, like thinking about how the public is operating in this sort of myth that the family builds about itself, and why there's a public imagined in this delineation of disability, right? So that was important. And then, you know, the disability justice piece is sort of, instead of saying like, I just want my disabled kid to be included, or my family to be included, you know, to sort of get rid of that binary and celebrate and center disabled people as normal. It's so basic in a weird way. It's just like, what if this were normalized? Right? And part of why it isn't is because we think it's never happened in our families before, until we are diagnosed or someone in our family is diagnosed. So that's part of it. And thinking of this as a collective enterprise means, you know, valuing our disabled kin and our literal family. And I really fight against the idea that if you're queer or disabled, you don't have a right to biological and family and ancestry. Like, we need that. We need to own that. It might not be your nuclear family, it might be your extended lineage, but I think that's a human need. And then connecting that to this larger sense of kin that you can only have if you are willing to identify as disabled as an identity, and not just a medical problem or an impairment or a personal body mind difference that is only you or your kid, right? If you see that as an identity with positive dimensions, right? And challenges, but also with positive dimensions, and connect with other people, would see it as collective. And this is where, since in fact, this isn't my idea, this is really a disability justice idea, that can be part of your kin. And I really want to connect our sort of individual sense of family with this larger sense of kin, and say queer people, disabled people, we have a right to both, and they shouldn't be separated. And it was so moving to me. I was reading the other day with a friend of mine, David Ambrose Jackson, who's an African-American gay man who is very embedded in the community he grew up in. And he was talking about, like, he had cousins with Down syndrome. And he said, you know, there was all kinds of ableism, but they were never separated from the family. And he was like, yeah, one of them was my babysitter. Like, he was like, yeah, you white people, man, you're crazy. Like, this is crazy talk. This is, you know, not. So I think there are models that it is a particular inheritance of sort of post-industrial white class, suburbanized, you know, this kind of nuclear family that has a particular kind of violence in its delineation. I think, not that it does, I don't want to romanticize everyone else, but you know, that really struck me in a deep place, right? He's about my age, same generation, and he was like, yeah, that would not happen in a working class Black family, actually. So I'm just saying these two things need to be connected: our larger sense of kinship with disabled people, right? And finding our disability lineage in our own biological or adoptive or whatever family we have, whatever family we come from, and not being denied that.
Absolutely. And it's often so difficult to find that within our biological and extended families. that connection to disability community is crucial to our survival. And I can say that about my disability justice community, which is, one of the best things that I can, I cannot even master without getting emotional, just how much I draw strength and inspiration, not inspiration, porn, inspiration to live and commute and be in solidarity with, and reciprocity and mutual aid, and just understanding our grip wisdom and our care networks, like Leah Lakshmi Pipsna Savara Singha so eloquently and so beautifully elaborates in all her works. And and that's been so important to me. And that, came along with this whole idea of, I was diagnosed very late in life as an autistic person, and then finding that community was also such a saving board. Like I don't know what I would do without the knowledge I have from my community, because I have no knowledge that is positive from the medical community regarding anything that has to do with autism, because none of it recognizes me as autistic, or deals with any of my challenges or any of the things that I would need to thrive as someone who is, quote, who if I would have lived during the era, contemporaneously with Hans Asperger, I would have been, obviously categorized and separated along the ones who were marked for living, but for experimentation and all of these horrendous things. But today that means that I'm not considered to be part of my autistic kin. So also, demonized along with neurodiversity activism by a lot of people who oppose it as being fake and as not being really autistic. So,
right.
And
like if you don't fit this one model of autism, you have to fight to prove that you're autistic. And if you do, you have to fight to prove that you're human. It's like either way, you're screwed,
yes.
Either way, like this model, it really doesn't work for anybody as far as I can tell.
Exactly. And that does not preclude a recognition that there is privilege in being a speaking autistic. Sure. And then also not being a Black autistic, because of what we've discussed. There's violent public spaces that make a Black autistic non-speaking body minds a target of violence, brutality, and death. But those two can coexist, and but it's obviously intricate. And Jennifer, I have a last question for you. I know we don't have tons of time, but let's see if we can get it in there. Okay, so Jennifer, you build on feminist theory to discuss how a capitalistic economy of care undergirds a racialized, gendered, and class distribution of labor. We discussed this, right? So within this system, we also discussed that care labor is often invisible, thus precarious, because it's often unremunerated. Now I want to connect that back to autism. So what I would like to ask is, could you please expand upon the precarious nature of care work in connection with this proliferating narratives of an autism diagnosis as seemingly unprecedented, again, as a traumatic and a tragic event for families?
Yeah, that I love how you're connecting things.
Yep.
I think this is part of this like crisis, trauma, epidemic narrative, that instead of an ordinary part of human diversity, neurodiversity is posed as an epidemic crisis. And my daughter got diagnosed kind of at the height of that, 2009, 2010. And when I would share that, people would say, oh, it's like what you're eating, or, all this stuff.
Yeah.
right? So instead of it, and it does in some way come down to thinking about access instead of like pathology. So instead of focusing on how to make education and work accessible to diverse body minds, to value them and create equitable systems of self-directed care, there's sort of this ableist panic, pathologizing, otherizing, delineating of autistic children. There's all this sort of gothic imagery and storytelling by moms who do feel isolated and overwhelmed. I don't want to, there are a lot of challenges that my family has, like challenges. I don't get into like what she can and can't do, but there's a lot, right? But the solution isn't to delineate, pathologize, hystericize, but instead, I think we need a sense of neurodiversity as part of human and familial lineage across generations, which would also help us have sort of a positive identity as a community. Instead, it's like the single individual autism mom's tragic crisis to solve alone. Dad just is supposed to pay for it, you see. And so I think that, we have to sort of think about what that pathologizing, tragic, hystericist, epidemic language, right? This viral imagery, that it's a discourse epidemic, and some of looking back at the AIDS pandemic, it's some of the same language was used to pathologize queer people, and instead think about what do people need for them to access care, access education, and that's going to be really different for different people. But to work collectively, to see yourself as part of a community that has value, So I think that, that crisis narrative is just so damaging. And I felt lost in it. I sort of try to describe this. I didn't reject it. It's like it had no room for the joy and particularity of my daughter. Everything about her was collapsed into this narrative, and I was either like a refrigerator, either a bad mom and somehow I'd done the wrong thing, or I was like a victim of my child somehow, just all of it just felt so like funhouse mirror to me. But that's all that there was. So I think reclaiming my disability lineage really helped me see us in a different way and find a community that values us. And my daughter is going to a birthday party this Saturday with her best friend, who is also a non-speaking autistic letterboard user, who she's known for almost like 8-9 years now, and they're both 15. They're going to be in each other's lives their whole lives, I'll bet, like our families are connected, our kids are connected. That's super important. So, find your people. If you're a disabled kid, find other kids who share your kid's disability, find their families. If there's no community, build it,
Build it.
And it can be really small and simple, but if you do it over time and don't buy into these pathological narratives, you save yourself a lot of guilt and shame, and like let go of all that, and figure, what does my family need to live a good life, right? What do I need to change systemically? But right here, small, local, finding a community for yourself and your family.
And you do such a beautiful job at weaving in those contradictions, right? Really focusing on what is it in the system that is failing, without you're resorting to a social model. You problematize the social model, you speak of Shakespeare's work, and you really invoke the postmodern or psychosocial model to explain that our disabilities are embodied, that they're material, that they're concrete, that there's not an amount of accommodations or changes that are gonna get rid of our embodied experiences, that those that lack of accessibility, that lack of understanding of pathologizing narratives and fascist legacies do not make our embodied experiences any better. So this whole idea of understanding that the system interacts with this, the system, propagates this ideas of crisis, so that it can interact with population control and all of these other ideas, but that there aren't sufficient resources to support mothers, of course, who care for their autistic children in terms of respite, in terms of actual beneficial therapies that are not other therapies. I'm not going to get into that. And all of these things, and it's especially so for Black mothers, for BIPOC mothers. And so it's not easy to just claim, and this is Anne McGuire's narrative in War and Autism, this whole idea of like, let's just blame the parent without looking at the system. So it's not one or the other. It is looking at how they both work. And that's what you also do in your book so beautifully. How do these systems and these experiences within the family work together, and unpacking them?
Thank you. Thank you.
I think we're out of time for our own discussion, but I'm so glad to have been in conversation with you. This is just, it's been amazing. Thank you so much for sharing so much with me and with everybody else. And of course, for your fantastic, amazing, wonderful book. People, please read this, because it's just, anyway, I've said it all, I think.
Oh, Sara, it means so much to me that, that it means so much to me that this had value for you. It really does, both emotionally and intellectually. It's just sort of a dream to engage. And I feel like, you're making me think about a million things too. So do we want to open up to the questions and answers?
Oh yeah, let's take a look at the Q&A. Okay, so, let's see. How do I approach lineage of disability when, speaking specifically to autism and neurodivergence, I am the first one to even seek a diagnosis?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. And, I do have some tips in the book. I think the first place to start, Desiree, is first of all, congratulations on your courage to seek a diagnosis, is to just believe that there were neurodivergent people in your family. Maybe not the exact same profile, right? But they were there, just sort of on a faith level, on a heart, spirit level. Believe that. And then the thing is to start talking about it with whoever in your family, and it might not be your nuclear family, it might be second cousin, it might be Uncle Louie, it might be someone farther afield, starting to talk about it, maybe using language like the neurodiversity might not be the language, but, Uncle Kenny seemed like, he was really more into books than socializing with large groups, or, you can just sort of ask questions without medical or diagnostic language, just to find out more. And you might not find out definitively, or you might, I found out more than I imagined I could. Right. So I think it's the first part is just to say, I have ancestors in my family, in my lineage. I do, or I wouldn't be here. Right. So I think that's one piece. And then honestly, You can look into medical records now online. You know, there are a lot of tools to noodle around. The sad truth is many people were segregated and institutionalized for things that we wouldn't even imagine doing so today, including autism. So not so long ago, I'm old, but I'm not that old, as I tell my students. I'm 55. I was born in 1966. These stories are all in my lifetime. So there may be people who were cut out of your family. So you can't know everything, right? But reinventing the myth is the first part. I think, you know, every family is a myth in some way, and saying this myth includes me and people like me. Photo albums, looking at people who look different, who disappeared, like why is that aunt not in the other pictures, or, you know, and there are always people in families who like to tell stories about the family. And especially older people, they are dying for someone to listen to them. And again, you know, I sort of have a policy, I don't talk about my family beyond what I've said in the book too much, but I have many broken and painful relationships in my family. It's not always the nuclear family. It's going to be the one you feel comfortable talking to or has the information. So I think that's kind of where you start, if that's helpful. And I have some other tips in the book. But I think even more important than reclaiming the particulars is just having the faith that the story of your family includes neurodiverse people. It has to.
It has to. It has to. I remember the old gene.
Yeah.
It has to. We've been here forever. It has to. If you're here, they were here.
They were here.
They were here. And they will be here. Okay. We have another question. What has surprised you and or heartened you as you have talked about this book with the public?
I think honestly, the most heartening and exciting and sometimes surprising part is how much people immediately start thinking about their own disability lineage, including people who don't themselves identify as disabled, or have differences that we don't call disability in our society. How immediately people kind of connect with that and get that piece of it and start rethinking their own family stories. I think the other part of it for me is imagining, you know, beyond my lifetime too, like that this book kind of helps us imagine our legacy, what we leave for the future. And I feel like this will be part of my legacy for my daughter beyond, whether she has children or not. So yeah, but really the heartening thing for me is listening to people who read the book or come to a talk start talking about their disability, like, oh, my grandmother was deaf, but we never said it aloud, or, you know, oh, I had an uncle, someone was telling me, this is like content warning, a little bit of an upsetting story, that they have a child who's autistic and that they had an uncle who was autistic who committed suicide, right? And that, like, they knew that fact, and that in some way the book helped them to sort of heal and reclaim that, and feel that that was a fear they were bringing to their parenting that they could let go of now, that they could sort of relineate that uncle in a way, and nobody talked about it and all that stuff, that you could, that could be used in a more positive way, actually. So I think stuff like that is exciting to me.
There's another question, and this one is for me. It says, hello, Sara, it's good to see you here. I had the chance to connect with you when you're here, still working for CIIS. Hi! I'm a current master's student with a disability at CIIS, so this talk is very meaningful to me. That's so wonderful. Coco, off, please. No, please. And I am very grateful for you both here. Thank you. Earlier in this talk, you both spoke about the assessment process and its shortcomings. I'm curious if you have more information on the history of disability assessment and any hopes, dreams, or desires for how assessment can look in the future to better support people. Oh, okay. Well, there are several books on, histories of disability that mention some of these assessments and, diagnostic categories and how things have evolved. There is Kim Nielsen's Disability History in the United States. There's Alison Carey's On the Margins of Citizenship. There's David Mitchell and Sharon Snyder's Cultural Locations of Disability. There's so many others, but if you email me, I will be happy to share those titles with you. There are others that would be, I think, more specifically addressing assessment more directly. I would have to look into that. But those that I just shared with you discuss the history along more general lines. As for what my hopes and dreams for how assessment can look in the future, having disabled professionals in the field, which is something that Jennifer also discusses in the book. If we are not represented in the curriculum, in the professions, in positions of power, in anywhere where we can make decisions about our own lives, about everything that pertains to the disability experience, there's nothing about us without us, right? There's nothing is going to change, even in small increments. We need that, and that is still something that we are fighting, and we are pushing for these changes, and those changes do not come about with inclusion. They do not. They come about with access, with starting with dismantling the structures that exist and recreating the structures anew. And that's why I problematize inclusion in my work so much, just simply because it doesn't work to fit us within a structure that was not made for us or with us in mind. So I think that that's the very first step, and to really start thinking beyond genocidal fascist ideas about what disability is in order to proceed with assessments that actually benefit us, as opposed to delineate us and mark us, not only from our families, but from our extended families and kinship within culture. Sorry, I think this might be a long-winded answer. I hope I answered partly. Thank you so much for your question. Okay, there's another one. As an adult who's deepening into disability culture with a disability that's largely passing in adulthood and not even recognized as a disability by others who share my embodied experience, I really resonate with Dr. Acevedo's share about navigating complex, contradictory communities. Do you have anything to share about the importance of sharing community with those who share diagnosis, embodied experience, while also acknowledging that CRIP community is vibrant and shared diagnosis is not necessarily essential? How does community begin when others don't see a shared lived experience as a disabled experience because of medical rhetoric? Wow, this is an amazing question. Whew. So, I am autistic and I live with chronic illness, right? These don't often overlap, and when they do, fantastic, right? I am sharing with both communities at the same time, but that wasn't always the case, because I was not diagnosed as autistic until later, when I was already involved with disability community. So it's not easy to feel at ease with a community when you don't feel like you are part of it. But I'll tell you that mostly comes from one's perspective more than from the community's perspective. I would say that disability justice communities are very welcoming, and non-judging, and they're not going to start counting and or asking, okay, let's see how disabled you are, let's measure you, because that's precisely what these communities aren't about. Not delineating, not demarcating, not measuring and seeing how much you belong or don't belong, because you belong within collective liberation, which is what disability justice communities are seeking. So, you know, I understand what you are struggling with, and when your disability isn't recognized as such, you know, I'll share a similar feeling whenever I come into non-disabled spaces and I say I'm autistic, and people try to hide their faces of disbelief, but they can't. It feels a certain way. Like I do better now when I receive those reactions, but it certainly stings, and it reminds me every day of Jennifer's ideas about these legacies of fascism and what it means to be separated from my autistic kin because of what I look like, what I don't look like, how I stim, how I don't stim, how because I have access to speech, and all other things that people do not see about my autism that are invisible to them. So I see how I can understand where you're coming from. I think that, yes, disability culture and CRIP community, CRIP, neuro CRIP, as I call it, is so vibrant that I don't think you have to share an embodied experience with a specific community to belong. I think that as long as you're doing the work toward collective liberation and contributing to the struggle, I don't think that you have to fit a specific embodied experience. I hope that makes sense. And I assure you that medical rhetoric is not something that those communities are going to be uplifting or upholding at all. Quite the opposite. Okay. What have been the hardest and most joyful parts of reclaiming your disabled kin? What can you share as words of advice for those going on that journey themselves? Jennifer.
I love that question. That's an amazing question. I think the most joyous, let's start with the joy. The most joyful part I talk about at the end of the book is really seeing my daughter in my grandmother, in cousin Rona, even in some way, the absence of XY. So seeing her as part of this lineage, seeing like the dress she chose kind of looks like Rona's dress. Her laugh is my grandmother's laugh, you know. So seeing really in her particularity. And then I think the hard part is, you know, there is a lot of ableism in my family, and this does upset people for me to talk about what hasn't been talked about, and that's hard. You know, I'm not immune to social pressures. I'm not immune to wanting to be accepted and liked by my family, and I don't want to upset people. That's not why I'm doing this. It isn't, you know, it's upsetting to talk about upsetting things. So I think that's not simple, but I do feel it's for a greater goal. You know, there's a greater vision here for this book than just about my family. And I think that my advice is really for those going on this journey is to start actually, before you know anything concrete about your disability lineage, just say there were people like me. There were people like my child. There were disabled people.
I'm not immune.
You know, so I think that's the place to start is with the myth. Every family is a myth, right? Every family has a story it tells about itself that's part fact, part fiction, and seeing yourself in that myth, allowing yourself to have a heritage, a lineage, a culture. That's really the place to start, I think.
And we have one last question, Jennifer. How can we start changing the conversations in our own families especially when the narrative around a relative with a disability is very negative and focuses a lot on pain and frustration.
Yeah. You know, I think the challenges are real. Physical pain is real. Impairment can be incredibly challenging. And I get frustrated sometimes in the disability community that there's not room for that, or you're like a bad mom if you're talking about that. So I think it's okay for that to be part of the conversation. You know, Alison Kafer says this thing like, I don't really want to be more disabled. That's not what this is about. So we don't have to minimize or sugarcoat challenges. But that's not all that's going on ever. So I think that's one piece of it. And so much of that negativity is stigma and shame. I think like there's actual physical pain, illness, etc., challenges, right, that actually every human body mind has, but some more than others, right? I think we can acknowledge that, but what makes that so difficult is the stigma and shame around it. And then I think, you know, and this is tricky because I don't want to get into the super crypt thing or silver lining, but I was thinking about, so recently, I'll just close with this. I've really gotten back into dance, and I caused a stress fracture in my foot that was painful, and I had to wear a boot, and I had to nag it. And I knew this was probably temporary, possibly not. But I had to navigate my whole life differently, wearing this boot, getting stared at, having to talk about it. And the people who I could talk about it, all the people who don't have a similar disability wanted to talk about was like how terrible it was, and when would the boot be off, and how did this happen. And I had to say the same story 1,000 times because it was hyper visible, like I hadn't had this. And it was sort of shocking to people, you know, so at my campus. And the people who had some wisdom to tell me about how, like, what the outcomes were likely to be, what if I had to have surgery, who weren't afraid to talk about like some negative outcomes of this, right, were people who had this physical disability related to their foot, right? Some permanent, some not. They had a lot of wisdom to share with me, and not because they're super magical crypts, right? They had lived experience of this far beyond me, and they could handle my own fears about it, right? I could say, what if this gets worse? So I think that's the other thing, that, you know, there's a lot of knowledge that disabled people have about their own disabilities that one can learn from, actually. So I think that's another piece of it. In terms of changing the conversation with your own family, I don't think there's a one size fits all way to do that, but as with most things, sort of being authentic and truthful is a lot of it. Something I try to do is, at first, all anyone wanted to ask me about was sort of, it was almost like she had the flu, like the symptoms of my, oh, does she do that because she's autistic? Da, 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 da. So I talk a lot about things that my daughter is into that have nothing to do with autism, or maybe they're shaped in some way, but are particular to her. And I always feel like I'm fighting for people to see my daughter in her particularity, right? That she's an individual. She's not. So that's something like pushing against, not because I'm in denial or something about the diagnosis, or but you know, fighting for the particularity. So when there's like Uncle Louie has this and that, and it's like he's also a great musician, or you know, he really enjoys, you know, cabbage or whatever. It can be really small, but to sort of reclaim the sort of whole person and their humanity, as not suppressing the disability, but also that like everything about that person isn't their disability either, even if it's inextricable in some way. You can't separate my daughter's writing from her disability, right? But I can talk about it in its particularity and share it. And I guess that's sort of my approach.
That's excellent. I want to add also that we are totally magic neurocrypt too. And that I totally agree with Jennifer, and there are political reasons for why we practice radical visibility of disability. And we do it very consciously, very actively, as an act of reclamation, of disability in public, which is something that really, really connects my work to Jennifer's work. The cultural reclamation and a contestation of public space as, inherently ours. And so it's important to also think about the performativity of identity in that sense. And those two are not mutually exclusive at all. So, Jennifer, do you have any last remarks?
Oh, thank you. I think that's my last remark is, Sara, this was so wonderful and so rich and juicy and fun. And I guess that's the other thing out of that doom and gloom, sort of like there's a lot of joy and fun in crip culture and disability experience, and in just, owning the particular body or mind that you have. There's a lot of joy and pleasure and connection possible, and I feel that tonight, so thank you for that.
Well, I want to totally echo that. It is so important to us, to really celebrate our joys, because there's always so much narrative about how miserable we are, how horrendous our lives are, how unworthy of living we are, that it's also a political act to really reclaim that joy, and to really bask in these moments where we are, we have these platforms for really delving into disability as a multifaceted, rich, three-dimensional experience that is just so joyful. I just always enjoy this kind of conversations with colleagues, and I'm just so glad to know you now. I know you now, I've met you, and now I am totally in love with your work. So thank you so much for joining me tonight. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And now we're welcoming Alex back to close the event tonight. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us this evening. We hope you'll join us for more of our upcoming talks and workshops. This conversation was recorded tonight, so if you'd like to watch it again or share it with your community, it will be available on our YouTube channel at this same link and later on our Facebook page. We're also going to feature this talk on our podcast, which you can find at CIISpod.com or by searching CIIS Public Programs on your favorite podcast app. Thank you again for joining us, and have a wonderful evening.